My name is Sylvia, I'm 23 years old, and until recently my life was pretty simple, perhaps even too simple. The house I live in was inherited from my grandmother, my mother's mother. He has been my refuge, my safe haven, ever since my mother passed away a few years ago. Aggressive cancer, swift and merciless, took her away so quickly that I didn't have time to realize the loss. After her death, it was just me and Dad in my life. He lived on the other side of the city, and despite the unbearable traffic jams, I visited him every Friday after work. It became our tradition. I would bring him his favorite Chinese takeaway, and we would spend the evenings watching old movies, talking, and reminiscing about Mom. These Fridays became something more for me than just family gatherings. It was a reminder that we are still a family, albeit diminished, but strong in our unity. But one day, everything changed. As usual, I came to Dad with a bag of fragrant food, ready for our usual evening. However, something was wrong. Dad paced nervously around the living room, fingering the edge of his sleeve. And most importantly, he wasn't alone. "Sylvia, dear, I want you to meet someone," he said, and there was a strange tension in his voice. A woman was sitting on the couch. She looked to be about 35 years old. Well-groomed, in an immaculately ironed shirt, with a perfect hairstyle and a polished smile, she radiated confidence. "Smile, this is Inez, my fiancé," Dad said. I almost dropped the food bags. Dad never once mentioned that he was dating anyone, let alone that he was serious enough to propose. Anger flared up in me. How could he forget my mother so quickly? But then I stopped myself. It's been a few years now, and he probably deserves to be happy, right? Inez got up, came up to me and held out her hand. "I've heard so much about you, Sylvia," she said warmly. "Your father talks about you all the time." I forced a smile and shook her hand. "Nice to meet you," I replied. My head was full of questions, but I tried to hold on. The evening started awkwardly, but as we ate and talked, the tension eased a little. Inez turned out to be sweet, and most importantly, it was obvious how much Dad was attracted to her. He looked at her tenderly, and she responded with gentle touches. And just when I was about to come to terms with the new reality, Inez suddenly added, "Oh, by the way, my boys will be so happy to meet you. They are 6 and 8 years old, such a wonderful age." I almost choked on the water. Boys, does she have children? Something about the way she said it, as an afterthought, as something self-evident bothered me, but I pushed that feeling aside. "That's great," I replied, trying to sound sincere. "I'm looking forward to meeting them." As I drove home that evening, my thoughts were spinning in a whirlwind. My quiet, predictable life, which was just me and Dad, turned into something completely different. After that first meeting, everything started spinning at an alarming rate, and before I knew it, Inez, along with her sons, Vicenzo and Alves, moved into their father's house. The boys were ordinary children their age, noisy, restless, sometimes moody, but at the same time they had moments when they seemed even cute. Vicenzo, the eldest, loved video games and could sit for hours with a console, completely immersed in virtual worlds. Alves, on the other hand, was a small hurricane that didn't even have 5 minutes to be on the move again. 4 months flew by, and suddenly it was time to plan a wedding. Inez immersed herself in the preparation with such passion and obsession that it became almost frightening. She seemed to want to control every detail, from the shade of the tablecloths to the exact arrangement of the flowers on the tables. "Sylvia, honey," she drawled in her sickly sweet voice, which always sounded a little forced. "Could you look after the boys for a couple of hours?" An urgent meeting with the florist, and the cake tasting was postponed. I didn't mind at first. It was only for a couple of hours, and I tried to be kind. I wanted to show my father that I was trying to adapt to a new situation. But the further we went, the more such requests appeared. At some point, I realized that I had become a kind of free babysitter for Vicenzo and Alves. And then came the wedding day. The ceremony started quite smoothly. The boys, washed and dressed up, behaved well, sat quietly, although it was obvious that it was difficult for them. But as the evening dragged on, and the guests enjoyed dinner and conversations, Vicenzo and Alves began to show their impatience. I was sitting at my table, idly picking at the side dish with a fork, when I noticed how Vicenzo, with a sly smile, threw a pea at his brother with a spoon. "Hey guys," I said firmly, approaching their table. "That's enough, you might hurt someone." But Alves had already grabbed his spoon, and in response, threw a lump of mashed potatoes at Vicenzo. "Stop it," I repeated, suppressing my irritation. "This is inappropriate behavior." And at that moment, Inez appeared next to me. Her manicured fingers gripped my wrist with unexpected force, and before I could say anything, she literally dragged me behind one of the pillars. "Never more, so don't tell my friends, children," she said through clenched teeth, her face contorted with anger. I froze, not recognizing this woman. Where has that sweet, smiling Inez I've known for the last few months gone? They threw food at other guests. I tried to explain, rubbing my hand where there were traces of her grip. But Inez didn't even let me finish. "Listen carefully," her voice became quiet, but that didn't make it any less threatening. "These are my children. You have no right to punish them. When you have your own, if you ever have any, then you can play mommy all you want. Until then, keep your mouth shut." Before I could answer, her face transformed again. She gave me that gracious, flawless smile and easily glided back into the hall, humming to Dad and charming the guests as if nothing had happened. The changes began just a few days after the wedding. It was as if Inez was just waiting to get a ring on her finger to show her true colors. Friday came, and as always, I went to my father's house. An hour in traffic, Dad's favorite lasagna from the restaurant where he and Mom went for anniversaries. But as soon as I entered the house, I realized that everything had changed. Inez was lying on the couch, our couch, where Mom and Dad used to sit. She was idly scrolling through her phone, and her children were running around the living room, making havoc. When Inez heard me enter, she didn't even bother to get up. She just looked at me and frowned with a slight hint of annoyance. "Oh, Sylvia," she said, "you really should call before you come." I froze in the doorway, clutching the bag of food, not immediately understanding the meaning of her words. "Should I call?" I asked, blinking. "But Dad and I always spend Friday nights together. This is our tradition." Inez finally put down her phone and sat up straighter. Her eyes narrowed and her voice became firmer. "Well, it's different now. Your father has a family." She paused, emphasizing the last word, and I felt uneasy. "And I will be the one who sets new traditions here." I looked at Dad, who was sitting in his chair, pretending to be engrossed in his tablet. He didn't say a word, didn't even look up. My father, who used to always stand up for me, who taught me to be brave and defend my opinion, now just sat in silence. There was a cold detachment in that silence, almost a betrayal. Inez's face suddenly lit up with joy, as if the tension and discontent that had just distorted her features were just a trick of the light. "But since you're here," she said, getting up from the couch and grabbing my purse. "You brought dinner, it's perfect. Your dad and I just wanted to try that new Italian restaurant downtown. We can have a real date and you can watch the boys." I didn't have time to answer, didn't even have time to realize what she had just said. Inez was already standing next to Dad, lightly touching his shoulder. "Come on, darling, let's get changed." Her voice was honey, enveloping but sticky. And they left. They just left without asking if I was free, without asking if I had any plans. I stood in the middle of the living room, feeling a lump rise in my throat. The lasagna I had brought especially for a quiet family evening with Dad was now on the plates in front of Vicenzo and Alves. The boys argued over who would get the bigger piece, tossed their forks, and laughed loudly, as if I were just another adult who had to serve them. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I spent 3 hours trying to deal with them, either spreading them out in the corners to stop another quarrel, or persuading them not to jump off the couch, or catching a vase on the fly, which Alvis almost knocked off. Time dragged by painfully slowly, and by the time Dad and Inez returned, closer to 11, I was at my limit. "Oh, we had such a wonderful evening," Inez exclaimed happily, giving me only a fleeting glance. She didn't even notice the chaos her children had left behind, or she didn't want to notice. "We're just exhausted," she added, yawning dramatically, and then turned to the boys. Inez didn't even thank me. She turned around, stifling another ostentatious yawn, and said, "Well, it's pretty late, isn't it, Sylvia? It's probably time for you to go home." It sounded like an order disguised as politeness, but I was too tired to argue. I just packed my things and left. But the next week, it got even worse. Inez, who did not work and according to her was engaged exclusively in household chores, began to invade my life. She started showing up at my house without warning, always with the boys. "I have an urgent doctor's appointment," she said, already backing away to her car as if she was afraid I would change my mind. "Or here," she threw carelessly, "your father is taking me to a new French restaurant. The boys hate French cuisine, we'll pick them up in a couple of hours." She didn't ask. She didn't even try to look like she was asking. She just left them as if I were her personal babysitter. Sometimes she appeared just when I was just returning from work, still in office clothes, tired and exhausted. After several weeks of this absurdity, I could no longer remain silent. One evening, after a particularly hard day, when I had 3 grueling presentations and lost 2 hours of work due to a system glitch, I returned home dreaming of a hot shower and silence. But Inez's SUV was waiting for me in the driveway. She was already unloading the boys and their backpacks, as if everything had been decided for me. "Excellent accuracy," she chirped, pushing Vikenzo towards my front door. "I have a spa appointment and then dinner with your dad. They'll meet for dinner in an hour." "No," I said sharply, not even leaving the car. "I wasn't hired to be your babysitter. I'm tired. I had a long day and I didn't agree to it." Inez's face contorted. Spots of irritation appeared on her cheeks. "How dare you?" she hissed and pulled the boys back to the car with such force that they fell silent in fright. "Boys, get in the car," she snapped, and then turned to me and her eyes flashed with rage. "You'll regret this attitude, Sylvia." She drove off, leaving black tire tracks in my driveway. I stood there for a few more moments, staring at the vanishing silhouette of the car, and then slowly returned to the house. I put the kettle on, made myself a strong cup of tea, and sat down on the couch, trying to relax. But as soon as I touched the cup, the phone rang. The father's name is on the screen. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he barked as soon as I picked up the phone. I froze. "Hey, Dad. How dare you talk to my wife like that? She's in tears." His voice was filled with anger. "Dad, please wait. This is a misunderstanding. Just listen to me." "You're cruel and selfish, Sylvia. I won't have you treating my wife like that. She was only kind to you." "Dad, please let me explain." But he had already hung up. I stood there, holding the phone, and felt everything inside me shrink with resentment and powerlessness. My father's voice, cold and distant, seemed to have erased from my memory all our years together, all the evenings spent talking, watching old movies, and remembering my mother. He wasn't listening, he wasn't hearing me, as if I wasn't a part of his life anymore. Through the buzzing in my ears, I heard him hang up the phone without saying goodbye, and in the silence that followed, it seemed to me that I was standing on the edge of some abyss. Everything that was dear to me crumbled to dust. The house, the family, the father, everything became a stranger, and I, as a stranger, stood in my own house, looking at the 2 boys who had been left to me, as if I were a babysitter hired without consent and warning. I sat down on the edge of the couch, feeling my legs tremble with tension. Meanwhile, Vikenzo and Alvis continued watching TV as if nothing had happened. Their indifference was unnerving. They didn't realize that something was wrong. Their mom left them with me, like putting a bag in a storage room, and stormed off without even thinking about how it might end. I looked at them and thought about how easily Inez had destroyed everything I knew. She broke into my life, forced me out of my father's house, subjugated him, and now, apparently, she has decided that my life is her property. Her words were still ringing in my ears. You're just sitting at home alone anyway. Consider it a practice when you finally find someone. Awful, cruelly, humiliating. I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together. It was wrong, all that. I couldn't just leave it like that. I got up and went into the bedroom, took the second set of keys out of the drawer. The one she had once given her father in case of unforeseen circumstances. It never occurred to me then that one day Inez would have this key, and that it was she, not my father, who would use it to break into my life. I took the key, held it in my fist, and felt the determination seep into every cell of my body. I couldn't let myself be used. I could not allow my house to become their next refuge, where I play the role of a servant. Returning to the living room, I sat down opposite the boys. Vicenzo Alves, I began slowly, so as not to frighten them, but my voice sounded firm. I'll take you to your house tomorrow morning. You can't stay here. Vicenzo looked at me with incomprehension. A shadow of resentment slipped into his gaze. But Mom said, he began. I know what your mom said, I interrupted. But this is my house. And I can't keep an eye on you. I am working. I have things to do. You have a father and a mother, and they should take care of you, not me. The boys exchanged glances. They didn't understand why their familiar world was collapsing. But it wasn't their choice. It was their mother's choice and my father's. I spent the night barely sleeping. Anger and resentment wouldn't let go. Thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind, taking away the calm. In the morning, I packed their backpacks, fed them breakfast, and took them to my father's house. Of course, it was empty. Inez and Dad were enjoying their honeymoon somewhere under palm trees, away from problems. I called Inez, leaving a short message. I took the boys home. They can't stay alone. Find them a babysitter. Glancing at the closed door of their house, I felt strangely relieved. It was the right thing to do. I didn't have to take it on myself. But the relief was short-lived. A few hours later, the phone rang. I answered almost immediately, my heart thudding in my chest. Did you decide to leave them alone in the house? Inez's voice was as cold as a knife blade. Are you crazy? They can't stay with me. I'm not a babysitter, I snapped. You left them without warning. Without asking, you had no right. There was silence on the other end of the line. I imagined her pursing her lips, considering how to react. You're going to regret this, Sylvia, she said softly, and there was a threat in her voice. You'll be very sorry. And she passed out. I slowly put the phone down on the table. Inez's words sounded like a premonition of something bad, but I couldn't give in to fear. I did what I thought was right. In the evening, the phone rang again. It was Dad. Have you lost your mind? His voice was harsh, full of anger. How dare you leave the children alone? I could barely contain myself. Dad, I took them home. I left you a message. It's your responsibility. I don't have to. You should have stayed with them, he interrupted. This is your family. My family, I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. I am your family, but you seem to have forgotten about it. There was silence on the phone. It was deafening. I don't want to hear those words from you anymore, he finally said coldly. If you are not ready to accept my family, then we have nothing to discuss. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. If it's that simple, why didn't you hire a babysitter before you fled to Hawaii? I asked, keeping the tremor out of my voice. We bought the tickets at the last minute, he replied, as if that phrase explained everything. There was no time to organize anything. Listen, I have to go, Inez is waiting. And a click, silence. I stood there, staring at my phone, barely able to process what had just happened. My father. The man who once punished me for a week just for not warning me about being 10 minutes late after school now thought it was okay to leave two small children in an empty house for a few hours. I slowly lowered the phone onto the table, feeling my stomach tighten. How did we end up here? When did he stop being the person who taught me responsibility, who said that family is sacred? That's when I noticed how Vikenzo was sprawled out on my couch, staring at his smartphone. His fingers skillfully slid across the screen, as if all the chaos of the last few days hadn't touched him at all. And suddenly, a thought struck me. Hey Vikenzo, I called, trying to sound casual. Do you have your father's phone number? I mean it. Your real father. Vikenzo didn't even look up from the screen. Yes, we talk a lot. Do you want me to show you? I nodded as I got closer, my heart beating faster. The boy opened the contact list and showed the screen. I quickly copied the number into my phone, trying not to show how tense that minute was. Thank you, I said, smiling, and hurried to my home office, closing the door behind me. I stood there in silence for a few seconds, clutching my phone before finally dialing the number. A beep, second. Hello, a deep male voice said. This is Mr. Cesari. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. Hello, Mr. Cesari. My name is Sylvia. We haven't met yet, but I am. I'm your son's new stepdaughter. I'm calling because there's a situation that you need to know about. There was a tense silence on the other end. What is the situation? His voice became instantly harsh, filled with concern. Are they all right? They're fine now, I replied hastily. But I have to tell you what happened. I've told you everything. About how Inez used me as a free babysitter, how she left the boys at my house without warning, how this week she broke in here with their spare key, left them alone, and then flew to Hawaii with my father without even telling me. The further I talked, the heavier his breathing became. Write me the address, he said firmly as soon as I finished. I'll be there in an hour. And Sylvia, thanks for telling me. Exactly 1 hour later, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw a tall man, about 40 years old. There was another man standing behind him, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. Dad, Vikenzo and Alves shouted in unison and rushed towards him. Goffredo Cesari knelt down, taking his sons in his arms. There was relief on his face, but also fatigue, heavy, etched into his features. Boys, get your things, he said softly, ruffling their hair. We're going home soon. And please clean up the mess, okay? He waited until the children had left, then turned to me. This is James Carlton, my lawyer, he introduced the second man. Do you mind if we talk for a few minutes? We sat down at the kitchen table while the boys were busy in the living room. The silence was heavy. Miss Newsy, James began, opening his notebook. Please tell me exactly what happened, from the very beginning. I started talking again, slowly in detail, about the wedding, about how Inez gradually started asking me to babysit the boys and then stopped asking at all. How she came without warning, left the children, just leaving. How I came home today and found them alone, surrounded by leftovers and chaos. And you're saying that Inez flew to Hawaii? James asked, writing down every detail. Yes, I nodded, with my father. They left without saying a word. And even worse, James interjected, frowning. She left them alone in your house. This is already going beyond carelessness. It's dangerous. I nodded slowly. The boys could have hurt themselves. We could have started a fire. Or, God forbid, open the door to someone. James wrote down the last words and looked up at me. We'll sue, he said decisively. Based on what we have heard, we have every chance to achieve a review of custody. Mr. Cesari, I will begin the preparations. Goffredo thanked him quietly, then looked back at me. Sylvia, his voice became quieter. Thanks for what you did, for not turning away. I nodded, barely hiding the burning in my eyes. I just want the boys to be okay. Oh, and I have this, I said, pulling out my phone. I have recorded my conversations with Inez and my father for today. Can it be useful? The lawyer's eyes lit up, and I saw confidence in them, as if my words had revealed a whole strategy to him. Very helpful, James said, holding out his hand. Could you send me these notes? I nodded and immediately sent the files. James turned on the recording, and Inez's condescending voice, her scornful words, and sarcastic laughter rang out in the silence of my kitchen. My father's voice, full of irritation and disdain, added an extra layer to the gravity of what was happening. When the recording ended, James nodded, his face still focused. That's exactly what we needed, he said. Leaving children unattended, threatening misuse of funds allocated for maintenance. Your ex-wife gave us a great opportunity. The next 2 weeks were surprisingly quiet. Not a single call, not a single message from Inez. Even my dad didn't come in to see if the boys were okay. They seemed more concerned about their Hawaiian paradise than the 2 children left without protection. Then Friday came. I had just returned from work, changed into comfortable clothes, and poured myself a cup of tea when the front door slammed open. Inez burst into the house like a hurricane. Her face was flushed with rage, and my father was standing behind her, silent, with a tense expression on his face. Inez was clutching an official envelope in her hand, and there was such hatred in her eyes that it seemed she could burn through walls. Vicenzo, Alves, stop it, she shouted, looking around. Where are my kids? I stayed sitting on my couch, surprisingly calm. They're with their father, I replied evenly. Inez froze. What kind of father? Stop it, she growled. I stood up slowly, looking her straight in the eye. With their real father, those who really care about their well-being. For a moment, her face was marble, almost expressionless, and then it burst into flames. She rushed towards me, her perfectly manicured nails almost digging into my hair. You little snake, she hissed, shaking the letter in front of my face. Do you know what this is? This is a notification from the family court. My ex-husband is applying for full custody. They're threatening to take my children away from me. Maybe you should have thought about that before leaving your kids in an empty house, I replied, standing up and looking at her directly, not backing down. Maybe you should have thought about using them as pawns and spending their alimony on a Hawaiian vacation. Inez turned to my father, clearly expecting him to come to her defense. I could see the confidence in her eyes because he had always been on her side before. But this time, something has changed. The father stepped forward. His face was contorted with rage, but not towards her. I never thought my own daughter could be so vindictive, he hissed. You destroyed your stepmother's family out of pure spite. As far as I can tell, you're not my daughter anymore. His words hit harder than any physical blow. I felt like I was out of breath for a moment, but I forced myself not to show weakness. I won't let them break me. I didn't destroy anything, I said coldly. Inez did it herself. Inez let out an almost inhuman scream and ran out of the house, slamming the door. Dad took one last look at me, full of disgust and pain, and without saying another word, he followed her. It's over. The custody hearing took place 3 weeks later. I sat in the witness box, feeling Inez's gaze burn right through me. Her eyes were full of hatred, and I knew that for her it was not only a struggle for the children, it was a personal war against me. I talked about everything, calmly, clearly, confidently, about how she left the boys in my house, how she flew away without even telling me, about how I found them scared and confused, about his calls which no one answered. The lawyer turned on the recording of my conversation with Inez, and her scornful laughter echoed through the hall. Consider this as a practice, in case you finally manage to find someone who wants to start a family with you. I heard the judge sigh loudly. His face became more gloomy with each new piece of evidence. Inez was confident at first, but by the time I finished my testimony, she was slumped in her chair. Her previous arrogance had evaporated. My father was sitting next to me, his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't say a word, didn't look in my direction. I saw how he clenched his hands, as if he couldn't cope with the internal tension. The verdict came down like a hammer. Full custody was awarded to Goffredo Cesari. Inez's alimony is terminated immediately. The judge issued a stern warning. Any further cases of endangering children will lead to the complete deprivation of her parental rights. One would have thought that losing custody of the children and financial stability would humble Inez and make her think about her actions, but I was wrong. Instead, they began a campaign of harassment with their father. My phone was bursting with messages, each one filled with anger and insults. When I blocked their numbers, they started calling from other phones. When these numbers were blocked, they started showing up at my house. They knocked on doors at any time of the day, not caring about decency, not thinking how it looked to my neighbors. Inez's shrill voice echoed all over the street, harsh, hysterical. "Open this door, you ruined my life, you ruined my family." I tried to ignore them. I closed the windows, turned off the lights, tried not to hear. But one day, after a particularly hard week at work, when it seemed that my nerves were stretched to the limit, when any little thing could be the last straw, I couldn't stand it. When the knocking started, insistent and loud, something inside me snapped. I went to the door and opened it. "Do you want to talk? Okay, let's talk." They burst into the house like a storm. Inez, burning with rage, instantly began cursing, her voice filling the entire space. "You ruined my life. You stole everything from me. How am I going to live now? How am I going to go to my procedures now if there is no alimony? How dare I interfere in her family, in her life?" I silently let her ramble on. I let this rage pour out, watching it spread across the room, filling it with lies and accusations. And then, when I realized that it was enough, I turned to my father. "Are you done?" I asked softly, but firmly enough to silence them both. Inez started to say something, but I raised my hand without taking my eyes off my father. "I'm not talking to you." He blinked, clearly not expecting this. "Dad," I continued, "do you remember Mom's house, the one you're living in now?" He tensed up. Inez froze as if she sensed danger. "The house that my mother left me in her will, the one I let you stay in, out of kindness." I straightened up, looking them both in the eye. "So that's what's going to happen. The harassment will stop, the calls will stop, the visits will stop, because if that doesn't happen, I'll evict you both. Quickly, faster than Inez can say spa day. And then we'll see how you survive, for one salary, without free housing, without alimony payments that have funded your lifestyle." Inez turned pale. My words hung in the air, heavy and final. I went to the door and opened it. "Mom would be ashamed of the way you're acting," I said softly but harshly. "Get out of my house." Inez grabbed her designer handbag, like a drowning man grabbing the last lifeline, and ran out the door. My father stood there, lost, as if he suddenly realized that he was left with nothing. I could see the regret in his eyes, or maybe it's just fatigue, but he didn't say anything, not a single word. He followed her out. That was 3 months ago. They haven't bothered me since. They didn't show up on the doorstep, didn't call, didn't send insults. The silence is like a taut string. It was only through family stories that I heard the rumors. Sarah, my cousin, met me by chance at the grocery store last week. She looked awkward, as if she didn't know how to start a conversation, but she said anyway. "Inez, she is, makes a scene, in stores, whenever you have to buy something in regular supermarkets. She can't accept that she can't afford boutiques anymore." She hesitated before adding, "Dad, he looks tired. They say he's aged a few years in these months." I nodded, but didn't say anything. Do I feel guilty? Do I regret it? Honestly, no. My father chose this life. He chose to stand by and watch his wife abuse my kindness. He chose silence when she abandoned her children at my house when they were scared and alone. He chose not to protect me but to renounce me. I have no regrets. Sometimes, to stand up for what's right, you have to be bad at someone's story. And that's fine with me, because I sleep peacefully. I know that Vikenzo and Alvas are safe, that they are loved and cared for. I know I did everything I could to protect them, even if it cost me my relationship with my own father. I still own the house my father lives in. No, I haven't evicted him yet, but it's nice to know that I have this opportunity. This is the card I can play if they ever start again. Write a comment on what you think about this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.